So this panel is about the future we want, and we're certainly going to get to that. But in order to talk about the future we want, we have to talk about the present we've got. And Mayor de Blasio touched on this a bit, but in the U.S., obviously, that means a federal government that is, in some ways, turning against climate action. And so I wanted to talk to all of the mayors about this new dynamic, but particularly to start with Mayor Emanuel. Safe to say you had a fairly good relationship with the last administration. That seems to be changing now.
You noticed.
Chicago has become a bit of a whipping post for the Trump administration. The president regularly tweets about crime rates there. You guys have just come out of a court case over sanctuary cities and immigration. So I wanted to talk to you a bit about how much tougher that makes your job of enacting climate action in the city without, not only without federal support, but in this sort of adversarial relationship with the administration.
Well, you didn't mention, so let me mention it. On Friday, the federal judge agreed with us on sanctuary cities, and so we obviously. I know this is about climate change, but some of these are interrelated because of immigrant policies, et cetera, related to actually the environment changing, drought effects, et cetera. But I would note that if you look at the beginning of his tenure, he said he was going to be okay on Dreamers and would fight administrations and cities on sanctuary cities. He's now lost on the sanctuary cities and fighting on Dreamers. It's the inverse of what he thought he was going to be doing 6 months ago, just as one political observation, in case anybody's interested. So on climate change, at least for a mayor in the city of Chicago, where an individual got 10% 6 months ago, is probably now trailing at about 4%. Fighting the president, if you're asking me from a political standpoint, it's easier. Second is he's on the wrong side of history, and third, he doesn't have really the policy analysis to deal with the problem. So on every measure you want to do, he's on the bottom 50%, short of 50%, so to say. On climate change, I would just say it's obviously would be better for, whether it's about a political problem, but it'd be better from a policy standpoint to have an administration with you than against you, because there's a lot of grants that come and things that you could be applying. I just came back from Israel, making the city of Chicago a major research center with every university in Israel on water research, conversion, conservation, et cetera, a major outproduct of climate change. The federal government's about to do a grant, about $100 million on water research. I'd rather have an administration that was willing to do that, embraced it as a part of a very important aspect, because about 20% of the world population, not Chicago, is not going to have access in 10 years to fresh drinking water. It's a major conflict, and one of the, I'll just say one anecdote if I can. When I was first became chief of staff for President Obama, the economist Mr. Sachs showed me a map of every civil war and every conflict in the world. And he showed me a map of all droughts. They're the same map. And I'm going to make Chicago the epicenter of all water research in the United States, with every university in Israel and every university in the city of Chicago. I'll take a bet right now in the next 10 years, 20 years, whether I'm right or President Trump's right about that, whether that should not be a place to be, both for the job creation, economic growth, and for actually the sustainability and livability of the city. And I will say, one second anecdote, and I said this to President Trump when it came to welcoming cities, which is how I refer to sanctuary cities. You notice as an investor, as a real estate investor, you only invest in sanctuary cities. You don't own a single property in a community that's hostile to immigrants. And I just said that, so forget the moral argument, because obviously that's not persuasive. But let me just say, on your bottom line as a real estate developer, name me one property you own in a community that's hostile to immigrants. The reason you don't invest in those is because they're not vibrant communities. You invest in communities that are welcoming cities, that welcome people from around the globe, whether that journey's the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Rio, or in the city of Chicago, the Mississippi. That will be true about climate change, and it's okay to be a mayor with a president that's hostile, because both A, we're right, and B, it's a contrast where he is absolutely wrong on a policy that has resonance now, which it did not 5 years ago, with the public. And I think you have to measure where the public was 5 years ago, where they are today on climate change. They're closer to understanding and appreciating the consequences, which is why they're asking for leaders who will stand up and make the decisions what we do in the next 2 to 3 years will determine what our cities will look like in the next 20 to 30 years.
And Mayor Robertson, until recently, you had a prime minister who wasn't what you might call a climate leader. So
there's hope. All of us.
You were sort of on the opposite side of the spectrum. So for our United States mayors who are coming into this new climate, talk us through how you handled that opposition, how you faced it, and how you handled it in your, I should note, attempt to become the greenest city in the world in Vancouver.
Yeah, well, thanks to everyone for being here, and C40 and New York Times for hosting us here. So we have bounced back in Canada from a climate hostile prime minister and government that was very pro fossil fuels and anti cities. And we organized in cities across Canada in that last federal election with an urban agenda and a very green climate agenda. And we're successful. The vote shifted in the cities across Canada, where most Canadians live, and we have ended up with Trudeau government, which came back strong on saying Canada's back and supportive of global climate action. We still need to get to the implementation piece of that more directly, and so it's still upon cities to hold our federal government accountable for the Paris Agreement commitments and for implementing those actions and supporting cities to follow through on our climate actions. But my hat's off to U.S. mayors and cities who stood up in the face of a contrarian president, to be polite, and reasserted that U.S. cities are committed to following through on Paris, and the proof's in the pudding. I think U.S. cities are having great success, both economically and in terms of a brighter future. This is the way forward, and the U.S. mayors recognize that. But it does take political organizing. We just been through a campaign in my province in British Columbia, where we had a government that had frozen a carbon tax for the last 6 years. We had progressive move of the carbon tax years ago, and then a government that came in that was very pro-fossil fuels and froze the carbon tax and stalled on the actions that were taking place at community level. We just saw a big changeover, and we now have a new government that is going to refocus on supporting an urban agenda, a pro-climate agenda, and make sure that BC is once again a leader. And that took organizing at a city level. That took organizing at a community level to point out those hostile policies that are doing damage and putting us behind the eight ball at a community and city level. So we have seen organizing in Canada in our cities to get rid of anti-climate conservative governments federally and provincially. And I think that stands us in good stead to achieve the goals we're setting at a local level.
And Mayor Adler, you have talked about the fact that the governor of Texas is declaring what you called a war on cities. I wondered if you could talk about how you see that impacting local climate policy that you're attempting to enact, and what you're doing about that opposition at the state level.
Well, there are a lot of things that may have changed last November, but one thing that didn't change was Austin, Texas, and our culture. We're kind of used to kind of the guerrilla war. We're the blueberry in the middle of the tomato soup. So we've had some experience with this. Although recently it seems to be directed at more than just Austin. It seems to be directed at cities generally. The interesting thing about the Paris Accord was that while everybody focused on the international nature of those agreements, at the same time that international meeting was happening, there was also a meeting of mayors in Paris, and it was the largest collection of mayors in one place in the history of the world, I'm told. Wonderful trip, thank you so much in Paris. But the mayors signed their own accord at that time. And when you look at the international accord, almost half of the stated goals of the Paris Accord has to be achieved at the local level, at the city level, or the regional level. So, our marching orders, our direction, our path was very clearly set also in Paris. And nothing that's happening at the federal level or at the state level can stop a city that is still making its own decisions on transportation and land planning. It's making its decisions on power generation. If you're a city like Austin, that is the benefit of having its own power company, but on the procurement decisions that are being made. So there's still a lot of control and a lot of opportunity for cities. And so regardless of what the climate is around us, what I continue to say to my community is that the rest of the country could go crazy, but we'll still be Austin.
And I want to stick with you for a minute. Given what you've just seen in Texas with Hurricane Harvey, I wondered if you could talk a bit about what you have learned about resilience to extreme weather caused by climate change. What have you learned about resilience in light of Harvey?
Well, if you had told me just 3 years ago that I was going to be speaking at a panel about the impacts of climate change, I would have been absolutely positive that I would have been talking about the continuation of this record drought that we were in the middle of in Texas, just praying for rain to happen. We've now had 100-year storms coming every 2 or 3 years in an area that is one of the most flash flood prone parts of the country. We had significant, unfortunately it's going to be happening to all of us whether you believe in it or not.
And again, what have you learned about creating more resilient cities? And feel free, any of the mayors, to jump in here too about what you learned in the face of a disaster like that, how you plan for it.
Well, you don't have any choice but to plan for it, and you can plan as best you can, and quite frankly, when you're actually in the middle of it, you find out all the things that you didn't plan for as part of that planning. But we have to plan across the spectrum. We have to be as prepared for a drought as we are for extreme flooding in our community. So the gamut runs wide.
Mayor Robertson, you mentioned earlier that you've been dealing with wildfires in Vancouver. As you confront new climate change-based challenges, how does that alter your strategy in Vancouver?
Yeah, it's a good question. So Vancouver, if you don't know, is renowned for rain. We are in a rainforest, although there's a good chunk of the year it doesn't rain that much. In the last 2 out of 3 years, we have had forest fires close enough to the city where we have weeks of air quality advisories. In a city that had the cleanest air of any major city in the world, all of a sudden we have weeks of forest fire smoke blanketing our city, and all the associated problems that come with air pollution like that. So it speaks when the biggest rainforest in North America is on fire, and we're seeing that kind of smoke. There's obviously a direct impact of that, but it's a sign of the times. The climate impacts in the north are particularly devastating in the Arctic and in the boreal forest. We're seeing unprecedented forest fires, permaculture melting. It's a worst case scenario, and that's impacting us farther and farther south as we go. Obviously, it's a different problem in the lower latitudes with floods and droughts and all the associated challenges. I would say that we're struggling, all of our cities, to even contemplate what infrastructure we have to change and how quickly we have to change it to deal with climate impacts. It's tens of billions of dollars in Vancouver to deal with keeping the ocean and sea level rise out of our city. And that's in the coming years. We don't know how fast we're going to have to spend to keep the ocean at bay, but that's hard infrastructure dollars that we have to spend to keep the city in good shape. The bigger piece that we're focused now with resilience is actually more social resilience. The impacts at a community and neighborhood level are dramatic, and there are a lot of efforts between cities right now through our networks to focus on resilience beyond the hard infrastructure and to ensure that people know how to adapt and deal with a crisis, but also this long, steady grind that is going to be more and more difficult, I think, at a local level. people need to be able to be better connected and be more resilient within their neighborhoods. And there's a lot of work that we're doing on that level.
There's a heads and tails of this kind of question. One is the reactive one, which was to Steve, which is I immediately, after both Texas and Florida, asked our Office of Emergency Management, police, fire, hospitals, etc. I like as best you can do an after-action report. What did they do right on the coordination? What did they do wrong? But that's a reactive to a kind of a climate event. Then there's what Greg talked about, which is kind of what do you do to do a preventive measure, which is a different side of that, the other side of the coin, to actually do something that, one, prepares your city and makes a contribution to a better climate change. And in the city of Chicago, we just got acknowledged last year, #1 city with 54 million square feet under retrofit. And we made that a policy, both public and private, so we've doubled down on that, which is, and we're at 40% of our way towards the Paris Agreement already. One is every building now will now get, we're introducing in City Council a rating up to 4 stars so that the consumers can demand a better building. We already have 54 million, we're going to double down as one of the biggest, and it was #1 in the United States. #2, and this is an idea for all of you about why mayors all meet and talk to each other. Greg came to Chicago about 4 years ago and mentioned something that they were doing on smart poles for streetlights. Just after work, we're now starting 2 weeks ago, we're retrofitting all 300,000+ streetlights in the city of Chicago to LED lighting with a smart grid attached to it, the largest of its kind in the country. And I mentioned this to you earlier because I actually think one of the biggest challenges we have, not just with climate change, but cities, is inclusive economic growth rather than exclusive. And the people that are assembling the street lights, LED lights, it's a west side of Chicago facility in a poor neighborhood, and it's ex-offenders. And so part of the whole climate change effort and the jobs is not only good environmental policy, good energy policy, but making sure other people who usually are on the outside of an economic growth are on the inside participating in that effort. In the same that we want to see that on the retrofit area. And Chicago is going to continue to take steps, as we did when we closed the 2 coal plants that operated in the city, and then make sure those who are doing that are part of our economic investments in our mass transit system and our other types of infrastructure that are going on. And we set up a $40 million green infrastructure fund for the work we're doing around the city, street paving, et cetera, to make it in a way that's partnering with our environmental policies. And so one question was about a reaction to an event. The other one was you're doing from a preventive standpoint to contribute as a city.
Got it. Mayor Emanuel, I want to stay with you for a second. Another crisis we're facing is this crisis of lost data with regard to climate. We've seen the Trump administration overhaul many of its websites, and when that happens, often a lot of that data is lost. The city of Chicago created a website to house that EPA data that is at risk of disappearing. So I wanted to ask you what you hope comes from that, A, and B, how do you build on that? Because if at the EPA climate change is being referred to as the double C word, you need the people building on top of that data and adding to that data set.
Well, I didn't realize when I was chief of staff that this would be my training would be to how to run kind of a counter to an administration, rather it was trying to complement. But I knew just because the EPA took it off of the website doesn't mean it disappeared. I mean, you don't need a PhD for that. And so I said, well, if they take it down, we'll put it up. The good news is a lot of colleagues around the United States did the same thing. Part of what we all have to do, and why Chicago on December 4th and 5th will be holding the North American, Canadian, U.S., and Mexican cities conference in the city, is to sign our pledges, is so then we will make public all of our benchmarks along the way to the Paris Agreement, so that there's a larger subject. You're not out of capacity just because the federal government is out of will. And so once they took the information down from the EPA, we put it up on our website from our Environmental Sustainability Office. I think I'm doing this by memory, I think another 10 to 20 cities did the same. So your constituents can access that information. And my goal is when we hold the conference in Chicago on December 4th and 5th, the C40 conference for what I would call the NAFTA countries, countries with the municipalities, is we'll all sign our individual customized plans of how we're going to reach the Paris protocols, and then make our information public as we annually on a benchmark basis, so we can show that both what contributions we're making, whether we're making ahead of schedule, and also our information about what we've done individually to get that. All they have is information. That doesn't mean the information can't be made available, and that's the beauty and power of technology in that effort. It's consistent with what we're about to do in City Council, which is we're now going to give a star rating, so that building, that information will be public. And I guarantee you the people working in that building are going to want to know whether that building owner is a 3-star, a 4-star, or a 2-star. And what is your plan to hit a 4-star? And that market force will drive us past the 54 million record-breaking for square feet for Chicago to a much higher level, and will continue to accelerate Chicago's ability to get and meet its obligations under the Paris protocols.
Yeah, well, I think Rahm's making a really good point that transparency is not only readily available, but that's how we operate at the city level, and making sure that we're putting our numbers out there, that we are reporting on a consistent basis. We have metrics, we're tracking it. I think that's living up to our responsibilities at a city level. We expect the same out of other levels of government, but we're going to report and we're going to take action. We're going to, comparable to what Chicago's doing. In Vancouver, we have a zero-emission building policy coming in. By 2030, every single building that's built in Vancouver will be zero-emission building. And that's all the new buildings, and we've got a retrofit strategy as well. So it's transforming the built environment. But we can't solve it all at the local level. We can't take the onus off of the federal governments, whether it's their energy policy and whether they're supporting fossil fuels or renewable energy. We have to push and hold them accountable for actions that match up to the Paris agreements. So we can take our local actions, like Paris has in banning diesels in the future. But we are seeing national governments like China a few days ago signaling they are going to end the manufacture and sale of fossil fuel consumption, internal combustion vehicles. So we are seeing countries from Europe to Asia that are taking action and signaling the end of an era and a shift to renewable energy powering our transportation. We're doing that at a local level with our buildings, and we need that combination to be successful right now. So as much as we can take on at a local level, we do have to keep up the pressure on the other levels of government to make sure that they follow through. And I think between governments, when China does that, when European countries do that, it's going to put a lot of pressure on the U.S. administration, and that signal that we just had that, well, maybe they won't pull out of the Paris commitments.
They were scared of this conference, so they decided to flip.
Happy that we scare them.
I was just saying that with respect to the data, I think the transparency is really important, because then the whole community gets involved and the government can be held accountable. So we have our pathway to get to a zero carbon footprint by 2050, and we have 151 steps we're taking between now and then, and people in our community can monitor that. A zero carbon footprint for city operations by 2020. We're at roughly 40% renewable energy in the portfolio right now, with a 65% goal by 2027. The community's going to be able to watch how we're doing that as we're doing that, and to hold the government accountable to those goals. And every 2 or 3 years by schedule, we're reviewing those goals to see if with the changes in technology we can improve on the goals that we've set. With respect to resource recovery and all the different things. We have one coal plant, and we know the schedule to phase that out, and everybody gets to watch that. So I think the data is real important.
You know, I don't know if this is a good thing or bad thing for me personally, but I was present for the Kyoto Agreement and then obviously Paris, but as a mayor. And I would just say there's two things that are different in the trajectory of climate change in a public opinion and engagement in that kind of arc of 20 years. One is, if you back on the Kyoto Agreement, people would have seen that whole debate as a threat to economic vitality. And what's clear in the last, I would say, 5 years, people have now come, the public as a whole, the conclusion that you can both pursue a set of goals and policies on climate change that actually enhance economic growth rather than look as a distraction. That's a major shift to when you think about where the debate was 20 years ago around Kyoto. The second is world events in Texas, Florida, but around the globe, drought, refugee, migration issues in Europe, are all a reflection that people now realize that this is real. Before it used to be, I don't mean to say this, but to be dramatic, but about a polar bear off on an ice sheet by themselves. Now they're seeing events where cities are coming under terror based on an environmental degradation, that those two events, and when you look at the arc of the debate, the public awareness, and the willingness to take action from Kyoto to Paris, tells you where this debate is going. And I think it's incumbent upon us in responsibilities of public life to continue to show examples where making good policies on the climate change and greenhouse gas emissions complement your social and economic goals rather than look like a distraction. And if we can do that, I think you're going to continue to get public support for bolder and bolder actions that reach deeper and deeper in the making sure that we stay on track for 2025.
Mayor Emanuel, you already answered what was going to be my last question, so I'll pose it to...
Given Rosh Hashanah's coming, it's so Jewish of me to do a Talmud. Don't give me the question, I'll give you the answer.
Perfect. Saves time. So I'll pose it to the two other mayors, which is that cities are also cultural centers in addition, to being the leaders in their state. And climate change has very much become a part of our culture wars here. So how do you approach that, and how do you win the culture wars in the debate over climate change?
Well, I would say there's not much of a debate about climate change in Vancouver or Canada. I think we have had certainly differences with a federal government that was very pro fossil fuels and denying the inevitable impacts on climate of that. That's shifted, but we still have commitments to build fossil fuel infrastructure. So there's still a gap right now in terms of Canada's federal energy policy and climate commitments. And at a local level, we'll keep challenging that. We obviously have concerns if fossil fuel infrastructure is still a priority when we're doing everything we can to go 100% renewable as quickly as we can. We know that's the future. We know that's what's good for our city. It creates jobs. It means a healthier city. And it's good for the social cohesion and being a welcoming city. It meets all of those tests. So, I think in terms of the climate debate, nature is showing us very clearly that there is no debate to be had. It's really about who gets their act together the quickest, takes advantage of the opportunities right now, and doesn't get left behind being a denier of our inevitable future. So I think there's lots of hope in our cities. I would say cities are where the most promise and opportunity is, and the most consensus around taking action to go green and fight climate change. The bigger challenge is supporting our rural sisters and brothers in a just transition off of the resource-based economy that is fossil fuel heavy in places like Canada. We have to support them in going renewable and to a clean economy, and because we're using those resources in our cities. So we have to take every step that we can to get off of fossil fuels and to support all the communities through the just transition by purchasing and supporting their shift to renewables and clean products.
I guess we're used to cultural wars, and this one is becoming an increasingly easier one to fight. I think Governor Brown was here a little bit earlier and was talking about the arc of the conversation that's happening, and you see that as the price of renewable energies come down. The cultural battle that was the false choice between having a good economy, as Rahm indicates, and being able to deal with sustainability, renewability doesn't exist the way that it used to. The recent solar contracts we've entered into have been historic lows. We have a community solar program for people who are interested in distributed power, and maybe their house is in the shade and they can't put it up, but they get to invest in a community array at a set price for a 15-year period of time. And there are people that are doing that because they think that in year 7 it's going to be making money for them, having invested in that community choice. The economies of the cities that are progressive on these issues are stronger economies. As is Austin within the state. As the cultural issue becomes easier when you begin to look at cities whose economies are doing well, not in spite of the positions that they're taking with respect to sustainability, but in part because of that. And it's not just the cultural answer where people that want to work, we have companies that come to Austin because the people that they want to hire want to live in Austin. That was an argument we always used to be able to make on these issues, that cultural issue, but now it's an economic issue. And I think that is changing the debate and the discussion. I think it will continue to change that cultural divide.
Well, thank you all 3 of you for being here, and thank you to all of you for staying with us.